Welcome all to the 2024 candidate forum for the Colorado State Legislature Election. My name is Clara Albright, and I am the Community Outreach Officer of Liberty Common High School. The focus of tonight's forum will be on the candidates' views regarding public education and charter schools. I would now like to introduce the candidates. From the 14th Senate District, Phoebe McWilliams, Cathy Kipp, and Jeff Brosius. From the 52nd House District, Steve Yurash and Yara Zokaie. From the 53rd House District, Donna and Andrew Boesnecker. You must live within the same House and Senate districts to vote for candidates in those districts. Go to the Colorado Secretary of State website to check your voter registration and which House and Senate districts you live in. On the student panel with me is Xander Bassett, the school's junior community outreach officer, who will aid me in asking questions, Liam Albright, who will be the timekeeper for the questions, and Peyton Bincer, who will aid in collecting note cards from the audience.
Audience members will not ask the candidates questions directly. Each one of you should have received an index card and pen as you walked in here tonight. If you need an index card or pen, please raise your hand. Awesome. Your index card is for you to submit questions for the candidates to answer. Please write one question per note card. Once you have filled out your note card, please raise your note card up into the air, and Peyton Bincer will collect it from you and bring it to us. We will then sort through all of your questions, and we will choose 5 to ask the candidates because that is all that we will have time for. The forum will begin with each candidate giving a 90-second opening statement. The candidate order was determined randomly. Once the candidates have all given their opening statements, Clara and I will ask the candidates 4 prepared questions. After these 4 questions have been answered by all of the candidates, we will ask the 5 questions that have been chosen from the audience. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer the question. They will receive a 15-second warning from the timekeeper. The candidate should quickly finalize their answer within these 15 seconds. The timekeeper will alert the candidates when time has expired. The candidate must halt their answer and allow the next candidate to begin his or her answer. Once all questions have been answered, each candidate will give a 30-second closing statement. That will conclude the forum. Now, we will begin with the opening statements. Mrs. Kipp, we will start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with us, and thanks to the students here at Liberty Common for pulling this forum together. We really appreciate it when young people want to engage in democracy. I think that's the best. So I'm State Representative Cathy Kipp. I have served in the State House, so we're not Congress, like we're not in Washington, we're down in Denver. Served in the State House for the past 6 years, and before that I served on the local school board for 7 years. I am now running for the state senate, which is also in Denver, and look forward to having a conversation with you all and earning your vote. I first ran for the state house because I wanted to make sure that we fund our public schools properly, right? All public schools, all public students deserve a good education, and that's what I think we really need to focus on. I do serve on right now the Finance Committee, and I'm chair of the Energy Environment Committee. I also have a couple of interim committees, which includes the Pension Review Commission and the Sales and Use Tax Simplification Task Force, because amazingly, if you just have a small business, you probably know, we have extraordinarily complicated sales and use tax system here in Colorado, and we're trying to make it easier. But anyways, we do lots of listening sessions and town halls. We really try and engage everybody. That's sort of what I've been doing since I've been on the school board and since, so really hope to see you at one of those. But thanks for engaging tonight.
All right, thank you, Ms. Kipp. Now we'll move on to Ms. McWilliams.
I'm number 2. Hi, I'm Phoebe McWilliams. I'm a candidate running for Senate District 14, which comprises most of Fort Collins, west of I-25, all the way to Horsetooth, down to 392 south and Highway 1 north. I'm a Fort Collins native, born and raised. I have 2 grown children. I was a police officer's wife for 20 years. As I was able to be a stay-at-home mom, I participated as a preschool teach mom, a homeroom mother, and a sports mom. I also founded Colorado's only nonprofit action organization, 501c3, working to improve the quality of care and life for nursing home residents. In order to prove my credibility, I had to learn the federal, state regulations and the Medicaid rules. I hope to be able to apply what I have learned and some skills that I have in the legislature. I feel I'm getting involved now because our legislature, I think, has gone in the wrong direction. Laws have been passed that are detrimental to my values, which is faith, family, and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McWilliams. Now we'll move on to Mr. Brosius.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having us today. Thanks to the school for putting this on. My name is Jeff Brosius. I'm running for Senate 14 as Libertarian. I don't have any experience in government, I'll be honest with you. I haven't been doing it for 20 years, but I do see over the past 20 years the direction Colorado's gone, and it's not in a positive direction. We have statewide approximately 42% of fourth graders that are proficient and meet expectations in English, and about 32% that meet or exceed expectations in math. We can do better, right, clearly. And I think that the priorities of the Colorado legislature over the past 20 years have been misguided. And I think that a direction of pro-freedom, pro-liberty, pro-individual rights, pro-choice as an individual, even if it's not the choice that your neighbor likes, right? And then along with that is a pro-responsibility. And that direction takes us in a positive method rather than the negative method I've been seeing for the past 21 years in the state of Colorado. So I'm running for Senate 14. I'd appreciate your vote. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Brosius. Now, Mr. Yurash.
Hi, thank you, Liberty Common and students, for putting on the candidate forum. I'm Steve Yurash. I am the Center Party candidate for House District 52. I am the new voice of the moderate majority. Both major parties are dysfunctional, and we see far too many extreme candidates because of the assembly and primary process that is dominated by those extreme elements. And that is why I started the Center Party. Public service is very important to me, and I have served on the Larimer County Board of Health and the Fort Collins Electric Board. My first job in high school was the cleanup boy in the local butcher shop. And I lived at home with my parents while I went to San Jose State and earned my degree in physics. I had a 38-year career in the computer chip industry, mostly with Intel, and mostly in design for test engineering. I have 3 kids. They're all in their 30s now. Stephanie has a degree in economics from the Milton Friedman School of Economics at the University of Chicago. Melissa was the Lambkin of the Year at Fort Collins High in her senior year and has a degree in statistics from the University of Denver. Brett attended Ridgeview Classical High School in Fort Collins and has a PhD in chemistry from UC Santa Barbara. So as you can tell, education is very important to me, as are charter schools, and I support Amendment 80. Thank you.
Thank you. Now to Ms. Zokaie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for spending part of your evening with us, and thanks to the students for putting this on. My name is Yara. I'm running for House District 52, South and East Fort Collins. I'm a tax attorney, community organizer, mom to 3 little boys. I currently serve as deputy assessor for Larimer County. I'm first-generation Iranian American. My parents fled Iran during the revolution, started over here with nothing to their name. My mom worked in construction and then construction management, and she now owns her own small fence company. And we're the definition of the American dream, and it's a lot harder, I think, for a family to do that now. I'm running so everybody has equal opportunity to achieve their dreams. I got involved in local politics with paid family leave to make sure every parent could take time off after having a baby or to take care of a sick loved one. We knocked on thousands of doors to get that over to the finish line, and it was a big grassroots feat. I also have a nonprofit called Latino Coalition. We're a nonprofit group, a nonpartisan group. We have done work to make sure that vaccines reach underserved areas and to make sure that everybody feels safe exercising their right to vote with successful voter registration drives. I'm a strong proponent of tax policy, public education, and affordable health care, and I hope to earn your support. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Zokaie. Now, Ms. Walter.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us this evening. I'm Donna Walter. I'm your Republican candidate for Fort Collins, House District 53. I've got 30 years as a volunteer citizen advocate at the state capitol, drafting bills as an advisor, over 40 years in private practice. There's a lot of bad things going on at the Capitol, particularly for children and taxpayers, and this is an excellent opportunity to make some changes in that. They're running bills that harm the taxpayer, harm your children, and the legislature believes that your children belong to them, and I don't believe that. They want to make laws that affect your children, telling them what they should do, how they should be, and I'd like to see that focus more on academics. There's a lot of bills that have been run regarding children that just have to arrest a teacher for calling a child by a non-preferred name is just, I find a lot of what's going on terrible. Your tax dollars, you want affordable housing, you can't keep jacking up the taxes and expect you're going to have affordable housing.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Walter. Now, Mr. Boesnecker.
Well, thank you so much, and good evening. My gratitude to the students for organizing this and certainly for Liberty for hosting. My name is State Representative Andrew Boesnecker. I am the State Representative for House District 53, and I have had the privilege of serving my community in that capacity since 2021. And it truly is an honor of a lifetime to be at the state capitol working on behalf of our community and really putting forward legislation which I believe reflects our community's values and also Northern Colorado's perspective on so many of the issues facing our state. I've had the privilege of serving on numerous committees in the state legislature. I am the current vice chair of the State Civic Veterans and Military Affairs Committee, the vice chair of the Legislative Audit Committee. I serve on the Transportation, Housing, and Local Government Committee, excuse me, the Appropriations Committee, Wildfire Matters Committee, and also the Health Insurance Exchange Oversight Committee. And so before coming to the state legislature, I worked for nonprofits. I was a public school teacher, a music teacher in a K-5 Title I school. 70% of our students were on free and reduced lunch. That is a value that I carry with me each and every day that I'm privileged to walk into that capitol. And I'm also a former Lutheran clergy. I started a series of house churches throughout Northern Colorado. My values in terms of how I continue to represent our community are found in the bills that I have passed: affordable housing, protecting reproductive health care, protecting our community from gun violence, working to mitigate climate change, and so many other pressing issues that I'm hoping we can talk about today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Boesnecker, and thank you to everyone for your opening statements. We will now move on to the 4 prepared questions. For Liberty Commons School, our philosophy in education is underscored by the universal truth, and that is, quote, "It is the right and responsibility of parents to direct the education and upbringing of their children," unquote. Do you fully support this universal truth? And outside of physical abuse and neglect, do you believe it is ever appropriate for state or school districts to override this truth? Ms. Zokaie, we'll begin with you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I believe that parents do direct their kids' education, and I think that is a partnership with schools, and that is something that is currently happening within our school district. So I'm proud to see that kind of partnership, and I think that it should continue. And I also want our students to feel safe and have school as a safe space and be able to have services available for them in school. So I don't see this as a pressing problem in our school district currently. I think parents are very much involved with their kids, and those resources are available for parents and for students.
Thank you, Ms. Zokaie. Now, Mr. Yurash.
I think that school choice is under attack in this state. And as I said, my son Brett attended Ridgeview Classical Charter School here in town. I support Amendment 80, which is on the ballot, which enshrines in the Constitution parents' and students' right to school choice. And I think that's very important. I absolutely support that. I hope that passes. It's a constitutional amendment, so you'll have to see how that gets tested, right? So if charter schools are shut down instead of local public schools, as was intended by a bill that was submitted to the legislature last year, I think that would be a significant test to that constitutional amendment. So I very much support choice in school. And not all charter schools are like Liberty Common. There is a very great range of different types of charter schools so that parents can choose what is most appropriate for them.
Thank you. Could you repeat the question for us?
Yes, the whole question?
Yeah, thank you.
For Liberty Common School, our philosophy in education is underscored by the universal truth, and that is, quote, "It is the right and responsibility of parents to direct the education and upbringing of their children." Do you fully support this universal truth, and outside of physical abuse and neglect, do you believe it is ever appropriate for the school district and the state to override this truth?
Thank you. So I'm a parent of 3 children in the Poudre School District, and I can tell you that as someone who has children everywhere from high school to elementary school, any given morning is the spectrum.
Outside of those very few exceptions that you mentioned, I'm in agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brosius. Now, Ms. Kipp.
Thank you. That's a great question. So let's start with the fact that Colorado offers lots and lots of school choice, right? You can choice into a neighborhood school. You can go to a charter school. You can go to pretty much any school in the state so long as there is room for you in that school, and every district sets out the parameters on how those students get selected. There is lots of school choice in the state. Nobody, I don't think, is looking to take that away. Yeah, there are some people who do have some issues with the transparency of some charter schools, with how the governance works, because they believe that all schools should be treated equally. But let's put that aside. There are other forms that people have the option of doing. They can go to private schools, they can homeschool their children, and a lot of people take advantage of that. Now, Amendment 80, which is on your ballot this year, I am actually opposed to that because we cannot pave the way for essentially to have school vouchers for people who decide to take non-public school options. Let's be clear, charter schools are public schools, so there is no threat to the funding of charter schools, but if we were to go down the road that some other states have of allowing essentially vouchers for private education, it would blow up our state budget, and we can barely afford the public schools that we have today.
Thank you, Ms. Kipp. Now on to the next question. Charter school organizations report an increasing level of what they perceive to be legislative hostility to charter schools at the state capitol.
Take it out of committee that I believe would have been pretty detrimental to our charter schools. I think it's really important to recognize that our charter schools are public schools. And to a certain extent, I think that message is lost inside of the state capitol. And at the same time, I also have a fiduciary responsibility as a state representative to say that when a public dollar is spent, regardless of where that is spent, that there should be accountability and transparency for how those public funds are spent. I think that is good fiscal policy just in terms of how we account for state dollars and how we fund education in our state. And I would include public schools that are neighborhood schools. I would include district charters inside of that. You need to make sure that what's happening with our budget and with our educational dollars actually is transparent to the public, because I think at the end of the day, you deserve that as a taxpayer, and certainly the parents deserve that as well. I would need a list of specific organizations that you are interpreting to be anti-charter or have otherwise expected things out of a candidate. I can say this, that I'm very comfortable standing in solidarity with our teachers, with our students, and with our parents. And as my colleague said, we have robust school choice here in Colorado, and I support the ability of parents to direct their children to the education that's appropriate for your family.
Thank you, Mr. Boesnecker. Now, Mr. Brosius.
Well, I would note that Mr. Boesnecker did not say yes or no to the original question, are you funded by any particular anti-school groups? My answer to that is simply no, I'm not. I'm not supported by any groups that oppose government oversight over charter schools, nor would I accept any such support, right? So the answer to the question ultimately is no. Right? If a candidate is supported by such a group, and then the second part of your question was how should that be interpreted? Am I correct? Right? I think that gets a little bit tricky. Is how do you interpret? Okay, well, this group supported me even though I didn't ask them to. Right? Fundamentally and ultimately, right? I don't see how you can say, oh, one group says they are in favor of this candidate when that candidate has no control over what that group says. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you for your time.
All right, Ms. Kipp?
Thank you. That's a great question. So, public schools are public schools. We are open to the public. We have charter schools. We have lots of organizations. I don't know which organizations specifically have all of which points of view, right? But I do understand that it is our job, as all public schools are funded with public dollars, that accountability and transparency with those dollars is important. So I think it is a fair question to bring up what waivers should be automatic, what should be allowed, what shouldn't be allowed. If neighborhood public schools and districts have to follow one set of rules, why is it okay for a different type of public school to follow a different school? I think it's a worthy and fair conversation, and I think it's something that we should talk about.
Thank you, Ms. Kipp. Now, Ms. McWilliams.
Could you repeat the question again? I think I've got it, but I want to make sure.
Charter school organizations report an increasing level of what they perceive to be legislative hostility to charter schools at the state capitol, including by special interest groups calling for heavier regulation or outright elimination of charter schools. Is your campaign supported by any groups calling for the elimination of charter school waivers or for more regulation of charter schools? If so, how should we interpret that support for your candidacy? Do your intentions align with theirs?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Actually, my candidacy is really, really small. I only receive individual donations at this point in time, and from the people that I know. As a matter of fact, I did receive a quite substantial donation from one of our existing legislators, and because her views are different than mine, I sent the check back, and I will continue to do that. Yes, I needed the money, but I won't be bought. I'm just a plain ordinary person, and I'm tired of all the crap going on. So that's who I am and what I do. So there you go.
All right. Thank you, Ms. McWilliams. Now, Mr. Yurash.
So I am not supported by the teachers union, and it's my understanding that the teachers union has been antagonistic to charter schools because the teachers at the charter schools are not part of the union, whereas my opponent is endorsed by the teachers union. It's on her website. On my website, I declare my support for charter schools and school choice. The bill in the legislature that Mr. Boesnecker mentioned would give the power to school boards when they need to close a school because of declining enrollment, that they could choose to close the charter school instead of a public school, which is under the control of the school board. That would give carte blanche to these school boards, which have been antagonistic to charter schools, the ability to shut down the charter schools. And I think that would be wrong, and it would probably be unconstitutional if Amendment 80 passed. So again, I think Amendment 80 is very important to enshrine in our state constitution that right for parents to choose charter schools or other school choices for their students.
Thank you, Mr. Yurash. Now, Ms. Zokaie.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, I'm proud to be supported by a broad range of organizations. I don't believe I've seen many organizations supporting my opponent, and that does include our teachers, it includes our students, it includes teachers that, some of them teach here. So I'm very proud to have a broad range of support, and they are supporting public education, and charter schools are included as part of public education. I think that we do need to do our part to make sure that our charter schools, our public schools, have the resources that they need, and that is something that I am dedicated to, and that's why I have a broad range of support from pro-public education organizations. I also believe that if we're going to spend state dollars on public education and supporting a wide range of schools and different school choices, that comes with transparency and accountability. I don't think that those things kill a charter school. I just believe that we should see, who's financing schools and what they are doing with those finances the same way we ask all of our schools. I do support school choice, and I think parents should choose the best education system that works for their kids.
Thank you, Ms. Zokaie. We will now move on to the next question. Charter schools are free to employ classroom instructors, regardless of whether they hold a state teacher's license. Do you support this long-standing provision of the State's Charter Schools Act as is, or do you think it should be modified in some way? Please explain. Ms. McWilliams, we will start with you.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said. Could you repeat that, please? A little
Yes.
bit louder, please.
Charter schools are free to employ classroom instructors, regardless of whether they hold a state teacher's license. Do you support this long-standing provision of the State's Charter Schools Act as is, or do you think it should be modified in some way? Please explain.
I'm not real familiar with what the state has required, so I really am not comfortable stating that at this point. I really would like not to see anybody ruin what y'all have here. What you have here is fantastic. So if anybody did try to do that, I would fight them tooth and nail. That helps.
Thank you.
Next.
Mr. Brosius, we'll go to you.
Yeah, so I'm fine with teachers not being, given the blessing by the state government, right? Some of the greatest teachers in my life had no formal training in what they taught me, right? My mother taught me how to cook. She never went to classic chef school, but she taught me how to cook a piece of salmon and some rice. My stepfather taught me how to change oil in a car, but he's not a professionally trained mechanic. He showed me where the oil plug was and how to take it out, how to put it back in, change the filter. And I don't think that you necessarily have to have the blessings of the government to be allowed to teach things for which you have extensive knowledge. So I'm fine with the idea that a charter school can have an educator who hasn't gone through the formal process of paying the dues to the government and filling out their forms and waiting 6 months for some faceless bureaucrat down in Denver to sign off on a piece of paper and say, yes, you can now teach the subject that you've known about for your entire life. I'm okay with that idea.
Thank you. Mrs. Kipp, we'll now go on to you.
Thank you, and that's a really interesting question. So I have toured your school. I know you have some teachers here who've, got a lot of life experience and have been, very well qualified in their fields. But I would ask you this question in response. Would you be okay with non-certified teachers teaching at regular public schools, right? Why should one organization, why should one type of public school have a waiver in this area when others don't? And I really think it's a fair question to ask. Wouldn't you want a licensed teacher in your student's classroom? Wouldn't that make sense? I mean, I understand where you guys are coming from on this because I know you have some teachers who don't have teacher licenses, but then I would ask why. There's lots of alternative routes to getting teacher licensure these days, and I think that the teachers who are really wanting to be in the classroom could certainly fulfill that requirement if they chose to.
Thank you. We will now move on to Mrs. Zokaie.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, I'm a data-driven decision maker, and I like to see information and see how things are working before I go off of my gut feeling. So I don't have enough data to see how this is working in the real world, and if unlicensed teachers, if we're seeing the same sort of education outcomes for students, and how that plays out later in their education. So I would want to see some of that first before taking a formal position. However, I will say I do agree with Rep. Kipp that this is a matter of fairness, and I think that what we do for one type of public school, we do for all. So that is something that we should look into. And what I'd be much more interested in exploring is if there are barriers to getting that licensure, so we can make sure that everybody who wants to teach and share their expertise has the ability to do so. And it's something that I do hear about from our teachers, that they have this expertise, and yet they feel like they have to jump through hoops and prove that they still know what they knew 10 years ago, and that it can become cumbersome. So that is something that I would be much more interested in exploring, is let's reduce some of those barriers. Let's treat teachers like they have the expertise that they do have. But I'd want to see some more data before taking a formal stance on that. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to Mr. Yurash.
So my partner, Amy, of 12 years, her son, Justin, is now teaching math at Wellington, and her daughter-in-law is teaching at Tavelli Elementary School. Her son, Justin, does not have a teacher credential, but math teachers are very much in demand, and requiring them or other science teachers to have a credential would lower the availability of math and science teachers. So it's very important not to have that credentialing requirement for those subjects, for sure. The accountability of whether the teachers are teaching correctly at a charter school is very close to the parents. The parents have very close contact with the administration. And so the fact that they don't have a credential is not as important, because you have accountability to the parents very directly, and they can make their opinions known as to whether the teachers are performing adequately or not. I am in favor of transparency, so that when a charter school is employing teachers that are not credentialed, the parents should know that, right? So I think as long as there's transparency and accountability, that the credentialing requirement is not required. And again, for math and science, it's very important.
Thank you. We'll now move on to Mr. Boesnecker.
Thank you for the question. As a former public school teacher myself, yes, I do support licensure for teachers. And at the same time, I recognize the way in which that can be really prohibitive or a barrier for folks entering the classroom in the first place. I came into the elementary school music teaching scene as a K-5 elementary school music teacher with a performance degree in percussion performance. I did not know percussion education. And there is, quite frankly, a difference between how you teach an instrument versus how you perform on that instrument. And I think it's really important to recognize that, with an interest in making sure that our educators have the resources they need to adequately teach our students and to be the most successful they can be in their field. I also recognize, however, as a former teacher, that there are a lot of barriers that come with licensure that we absolutely can look at as a state. And that includes the regular evaluation process. If you have a teacher that has been successful time and time again in the classroom, we can look at expanding that timeline so that you're not evaluated yearly for something that's going to come back with the same answer. I also support very alternative pathways to getting that licensure. State of Florida, where I taught, gave you 3 years to be in the classroom while you were working on your continuing education credits to get that license in place. And I think there's all sorts of things that we can do to make sure that if you are a qualified teacher without a license, that we make that pathway easy for you to attain a license and continue to teach in our state like you should be.
Thank you. We'll now move on to Ms. Walter.
Thank you very much. A lot of you may have noticed I'm not real big into word salads. The question maybe should be, why are there so many roadblocks to teachers teaching at public schools? I homeschooled my son. I taught at the vocational technical school. I don't have teacher credentials, and the students actually excelled under me. There didn't used to be a teacher license at one time. Maybe that's one of these, only my hairdresser knows for sure, but teachers were not always licensed. So maybe the question ought to be is why are there so many roadblocks to having teachers performing their duties and teaching the students? Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to the next question. Colorado is regarded as a local control state regarding public education. So when it comes to curriculum, this is something understood to reside with local school districts. Are there any topics, subjects, or academic disciplines for which you would support state curricular mandates? Mr. Yurash, we will start with you.
Well, I don't know about curricula standards. You have to have performance standards, and I absolutely support standardized testing as a accurate, well, useful measure of student performance. And there have been attempts to eliminate some of the standardized testing, and in fact, some of the colleges have eliminated in the past their need to have standardized testing, such as the ACT or SAT. They're now finally realizing that those tests are actually a good measure of student performance in college. And so there are some of the top colleges that are now requiring submission of the SAT and ACT testing. So I know for a fact that as Bob has explained to me once in the past, that the math curriculum at Liberty Common does not follow the exact sequence as is required in some of the state testing, but that is determined by school staff to give a better, deeper understanding of the subject. And so, again, I think charter schools and any school should be allowed to do their own curriculum as long as parents have input and transparency of that curriculum.
Thank you. We will now move on to Ms. Zokaie.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Of course. Colorado is regarded as a local control state regarding public education. So when it comes to curriculum, this is something understood to reside with local school districts. Are there any topics, subjects, or academic disciplines for which you would support state curricular mandates?
I do think that schools should be held to the same standards, and that if we're going to have a public education system, we should have certain expectations for, what our kids are learning. However, I don't know of anything specifically at the state that would be appropriate. I do support creating a safe and inclusive learning environment for everybody. If there's concerns where we think a kid with special needs or a child who has English as a second language, as I do, if we feel like they're not having their needs met in a school, I think that's something that we should address. But as far as mandating specific curriculum, there's nothing that comes to mind that I think that the state should be interfering with. I will say I don't think that politics has a place in our public schools, whether that's from the right or from the left. I just think that that's not something that should be included in public education.
Thank you. We will now move on to Ms. Walter.
I'm going to have you please repeat the question. Could you go maybe a little slower when you're speaking? I'm not the only one that's having a problem understanding you. Thank you.
Colorado is regarded as a local control state regarding public education. So when it comes to curriculum, this is something understood to reside with local school districts. Are there any topics, subjects, or academic disciplines for which you would support state curricular mandates?
No. Local school districts rule. Pass the salad dressing. Thank you.
Mr. Boesnecker, we'll now move on to you.
Thank you for the question. So very supportive of our local school board and the decisions that they make, and certainly direct folks their way when there is a question about curriculum or other things that are being taught in our public schools. I will say, however, there is, I think, a need, while the curriculum lives at the local level, there are standards that live at the state level and I think are really important. And I think when we look at how certain subjects are taught in other states, it reinforces the importance of making sure that in Colorado, we are telling the whole history and a real true history of what has happened with certain events. And I'll point towards different states' explanations of why the Civil War happened, for example. I moved here from Atlanta, Georgia in 2009, and I can tell you that in some of our southern school districts, there is a continued press towards the narrative that the Civil War was simply about states' rights. And you'll notice a huge blank spot in that narrative that leaves out the suffering and the ongoing oppression of black people in the United States of America. I think at the same time, we can tell the truth about something in a way that gives our students the ability to navigate that truth with the discomfort that some truth brings. And that includes the rights of LGBTQ+ folks in our communities, the rights of undocumented folks in our communities, the rights of Black Americans and Latino Americans in our communities. And it is critical to me that whatever we decide those standards are, that we are telling the whole truth and letting our students wrestle with some of the discomfort that rightly lives with us as a democracy.
Thank you. We will now move on to Mr. Brosius.
The question is, are there any standards that should be handed down from the state level, right, down to all school districts? And the answer again here, I think, is no, right? Coming back once again to that localized control, we as a community here know what's best for us, but we don't necessarily know what is best for, let's say, Yuma, Colorado, or Springfield, or Two Buttes, or Craig, right? It's a bit arrogant, I think, to presume that you know what's best for everybody in Colorado. So my answer to the original question would be no, I would not support any particular mandates from the state down to the local school districts. I think the local school districts are comprised of people who know what's best for them, right? I don't know what's best for all of y'all. I'll be honest, I don't. I think you guys know what's best for you, and I think you all are smart enough to make that decision for yourselves, and you don't need somebody in the state Senate or the state House telling you what that decision is. So the answer to the original question is no, I would not support any mandates from the state. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to Ms. Kipp.
Whoops.
I got you.
Thanks. Just dropped my pen. Sorry, it's a long ways down. Thank you very much. So that's a great question. So let's back up a little bit. I think we're confusing some of our terminology. So curriculum is how you teach material, right? So really the state doesn't care how you teach it. You can teach it dancing and singing, you can teach it with a particular classical method, or you can teach it in any kind of method that you choose. We did establish state standards for various topics back in, actually it was when Patrick and I were on the school board together in 2011. It was when I first started on the school board. And that was from legislation that came down that basically said, a kid who's learning algebra in one part of the state should be learning the same types of the same things that a kid in another part of the state. We don't want to have kids in one part of the state having an inferior education. So now we have standards that are set and reevaluated every 6 years in every area. And so if your school teaches that subject area, you are expected to have learned those standards. Now you can learn other stuff, right? You can learn different things, but you do need to learn those standards. There are very few things that the state requires, for instance, as graduation requirements and actual requirements that a kid take. Those are mostly established at the district level and by your local school.
Thank you. We will now move on to Ms. McWilliams.
Thank you. I'm going to raise a big issue that's been bugging me for a long time, and I encountered that way back when my kids were in preschool and kindergarten, and that's the fact that we have illegal immigrants in particular, that flood our schools and don't speak English, and yet the teachers have to make time for those children, and that takes away time for our kids to learn the skills that they need to learn in school. So that's one thing that I think we better take a look at, because we have the illegal immigrants coming in. We also have, I've heard stories of 16 and 17-year-olds being in grade school that don't speak English, and they're male students on top of that. So there's a safety issue that I have also. So I would be looking at that and would think that the school boards need to take a strong look at that right away. The state should take a look at illegal immigration and the impact that the illegal immigrations are having immigrants are having on our schools. Granted, they can provide, an insight into a life that we don't have and haven't had. However, our priorities should be our students, our citizen students, and the other kids could be in a separate place where they learn English
Thank
first.
you, Ms. McWilliams.
Thank you.
Now we will move on to the 5 questions chosen from the audience. Mr. Boesnecker, we'll begin with you. What do you think are the most important steps to make sure Colorado schools are adequately funded?
Thank you. It's an important question, and obviously we understand that Colorado schools continue to be underfunded, and certainly our students and our teachers hang in the balance of that equation. One thing I'm immensely proud of is our ability to pay down the negative factor this last budget cycle. That was legislation passed, and the long bill took care of that. However, at present, what that means is that we are funding education in the state of Colorado at a metric that assumes that at 1980 levels funding for a student is appropriate in 2024. In 1980, I was blowing out Nintendo cartridges. Well, maybe not quite yet. Atari, there you go. And so I think at the 1989 standard, I think is the funding model we use at present. Yeah, and so I think what we need to look at is the adequacy study that's gonna come back and really understand what does it cost dollar-wise to educate a student in the state of Colorado. And then of course there's a difficult conversation to be had about how do we get those dollars into the hands of our students and into the hands of our teachers. Because that's another challenge that Tabor presents our state, is that quite frankly we pit equal values against one another in an effort to fund transit, in an effort to fund housing, in an effort to fund Medicaid, in an effort to fund education. These are all really valuable endeavors that we of course should invest in as a state, but I think the first thing we need to do is understand what is the appropriate amount of funding that each student requires in our state, and of course we can lean on our federal partners to actually fully fund special education in our state. That should have happened decades ago. As it stands, I think we need more data to be able to move the needle on this piece.
Thank you, Mr. Boesnecker. Now, Ms. Walter.
Are we doing the same question for everybody? Would you please repeat it then? Thank you.
What do you think are the most important steps to make sure Colorado schools are adequately funded?
Look at your budget. We do get enough money in. And right now we had Prop HH that actually raised people's property taxes 25 to 100%. Where does that money go? Does anybody ever bother to look at the budget? Where's it going? So we actually have money. How is it being spent? I support Tabor, and the School Finance Act may be needing a little tweaking, but some of this money, I don't see a lot of accountability, so we have the money. Where's it being spent? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walter. Now, Ms. Kipp.
Thank you, and I would like to first make a clarification. Proposition HH never passed. That was on the ballot that year. That failed. We had a special session. We talked about property taxes. We continued to talk about property taxes during the entire session. We had a special commission set up. At the end of the legislative session, we put a bill forward that was theoretically a bipartisan compromise to lower property taxes, essentially be a replacement for Gallagher, which was an amendment that was repealed by the voters in 2020. We brought, apparently some people did not feel there was a bipartisan agreement. Well, we had a bipartisan agreement among the legislature. Other people outside of the legislature did not believe there was an agreement, so they brought us back for another special session. Taxes were cut more. I will just say that yeah, you can keep cutting property taxes, but understand how your schools are funded. If your property taxes are collecting a certain amount of money, that goes to your per pupil funding. That money is backfilled by the state to get to the amount of per pupil funding that is required. So the less money that you are collecting at the local level means that there's more money that you have to find at the state level. We're going to have to cut $1 billion from the state budget this year. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful, and the special session didn't help. But I just want to say that Rep. Boesnecker said everything about the adequacy study.
Now, Ms. McWilliams.
Thank you. Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I get lost in everything.
What do you think are the most important steps to make sure Colorado schools are adequately funded?
Okay. Let's start with right in the classroom. What is it that the teachers need in the classroom? What is it that the students need? And what's being done by our school board? Right now, I'm a little bit perturbed at our school board with the things that are being taught in my schools, in my public schools, things that have nothing to do with learning, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that needs to stop. Schools aren't there to provide health care. They're not there to, set people apart. It's just, I'm getting lost, but there's things that we need to do. And one of the things that we as taxpayers need to do, our taxes, our property taxes are based on mill levies. The school, the hospital, the library, the fire, the police department, they have people inside their situations, like committees, and who are those committees that decide how much they want to raise mill levies. We have a public library here who has an unelected bureaucrat committee that has decided they want to continue to raise our mill levies, when in fact they have $1 million and they're sitting on it. And what are they doing that for? Just so they can say that they're raising the mill levy? The taxpayers need to get involved. We need to be informed. What is happening to our money?
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
McWilliams. Now, Mr. Brosius.
So the question is, how do we ensure that schools are adequately funded, correct? So I would say we don't. I say we make sure that the student is adequately funded. And Colorado's got the money. In 2018, Colorado State budget was $30 billion. In 2024, it was $40 billion. That's a 30% increase in 6 years. Anybody here get a 30% raise in the past 6 years? Raise your hand, because I didn't, right? So I would say we've got the money, right? Where we need to do better job of is allocating that money to an efficient process, right? Get the money to the student, make the schools compete for that student's money, that family's school money, right? You as parents, you make decisions on how to spend money all the time, right? Whether it's, you go to the grocery store, you make a choice. Do I buy ground beef? Do I buy, 80-20? Do I buy 93-7, right? Do I buy a roast? Do I buy a steak? Do I buy chicken? You make those choices all the time. You have a budget as a family. Well, let's get you that tax money, and then you can use that and budget for your child's education, rather than the state saying, this is how much we're going to allow per student. So I would say you don't fund the schools, you fund the student. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Brosius. Now, Ms. Zokaie.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There seems to be disagreement about whether our schools need resources. As a parent with 3 kids in school, I can tell you that I think that they do need more resources. However, that's why we study these things. That's why we get data. It doesn't feel like 1989 levels are correct for school funding. Maybe they are, and we'll figure that information out and pour through the study that came out and find out what it really does cost to educate a child adequately. I think that we do need to understand how school funding works, in that our property taxes can go up, and we feel like our schools are getting that, and it does not change the amount, it just changes the backfill from the state. So I would like my increase in property taxes to go to my schools, and it just doesn't end up changing the overall per pupil funding that our schools receive. I would like to increase that per pupil funding. Tabor does have a chokehold on our state that makes it difficult for us to adequately fund our education system. I think there are some ways around that. We don't have a fair tax code. Our lowest earners are paying a higher effective tax rate than our highest earners. There's clearly something wrong with that. We could close corporate tax loopholes to bring additional money in. But I think that as folks want to have schools that are higher performing, they want to have resources in their schools, they also need to realize that there is a cost to that, and that Tabor is keeping that from happening.
Thank you, Ms. Zokaie. Now, Mr. Yurash.
So I definitely support Tabor, because the legislature is not going to be responsible enough to keep our tax rate growth low in relation to population growth and income growth. So I definitely support Tabor. That is a big difference between me and my opponent. But I do want schools to be adequately funded. Yeah, most of it comes from the mill levy and the property taxes. And I believe the recent agreement and bill signed by the legislature did provide to maintain the mill levy at present levels or prior levels for the schools, but lower the mill levy amounts for the other local government areas. And so I think that was a good compromise, right? Because we do need more funding for the schools. But there is for Collins and the Poudre School District a mill levy increase for the schools on the ballot. Unfortunately, I'm going to vote no on that. I would want to vote yes, but the levy increase is too large and there's not enough definition of how the money will be spent. So I agree with a lot of the other comments that the money needs to go to educating students in the classroom. There's too much money being spent on other administrative tasks. You see what the charter schools do. They spend a lot less on administrative tasks than the public schools do. So it is a matter of
Thank you, Mr. Yurash.
priority.
Now we will move on to the next question. There is a difference between right and opportunity. How do you think this applies to public education? Mr. Brosius, we'll begin with you.
The term right is thrown around quite a bit as something that people should automatically have just by mere existence, right? A right to health care, a right to education, a right to transit, a right to safe streets to walk down. And the delineator for me becomes whether or not another person's labor is involved, right? If you're requiring the actions and efforts and knowledge of another person to provide something to you, then it's no longer a right. It becomes now a commodity that you're obtaining as opposed to your right to, let's say, worship. You're free to worship your deity of choice, and it requires absolutely no action from me whatsoever. I have a right to speak my mind on a given subject, and it requires no action from any of you whatsoever. So the difference between right and commodity is whether or not another person, opportunity or commodity? Opportunity, my apology. The difference there becomes whether or not another person is required to provide it to you.
Thank you, Mr. Brosius. Now, Ms. Kipp.
Thank you. The Colorado State Constitution guarantees a free and uniform education for children in Colorado, period. That's our right as Coloradans. If you're a Colorado kid, you have that opportunity to go to public schools and be funded for free and get that public education. That is your right. But I do believe it is our job to make sure that all children have opportunity, right? And you can go into equity, equality, all that stuff. Let's return to the funding conversation a little bit because I didn't get as far as I wanted in talking about that. So one of the things that the adequacy studies that we have commissioned at the state level have done is we're doing a comprehensive analysis of what does it cost to adequately educate a kid in Colorado, right? In 2024, not 1989. We need to figure that out so that we can figure out where that goalpost should be. Finally, this year, we have gotten back to that 1989 level. It's been a lot of work over the last 6 years, my 6 years in the State House. We've made progress every year in improving the funding for education. And for those people who don't want to fund education, I'm just going to tell you, if you cut off funding for education, you're just going to be in a worse place. And we've not adequately funded our schools since at least 2000 when we passed Amendment 23.
Thank you, Ms. Kipp. Now, Ms. McWilliams.
Thank you. The difference between the right and the opportunity is that, That's really an interesting question, and I'm trying to think of something that would apply. I have rights. We have our constitutional rights. We have our Declaration of Independence. And opportunity is a door that opens. you know? And do you take that opportunity? Do you step through that door and take that opportunity, whether it's a higher education or it's a job as a plumber and you learn a trade? That's a difference I see between a right and an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McWilliams. Now, Mr. Yurash.
So to dovetail into the previous question, actually, I think it is important that the state have the equalization factor to add state tax funds to schools in lower income areas, underserved areas of black and brown neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods. And I think that is a way to create more opportunity for the people in those underserved neighborhoods. So I think that's a very important factor. So if you have a right to an education, but decide not to graduate from high school, you're missing the opportunity. So what do we do with people who have been given an opportunity and have failed to take advantage of it? Are we now expected to think that, well, did we take their rights away? So you have to, it's not always obvious whether someone's rights are being violated or whether they specifically chose not to take advantage of the opportunity that was given to them. It's definitely incumbent upon us to make sure that the underserved neighborhoods are at least financially able to provide somewhat equal or as equal as we can make them opportunities for an education.
Thank you, Mr. Yurash. Now, Ms. Zokaie.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an interesting one. You know, public education is the great equalizer, and we do have a right in this state, in this country, for every child to have a free and uniform education. That is a right. I believe that we also need to provide equal opportunities, and that means that people who are struggling or who have certain barriers, that we need to step in and help reduce those barriers. You know, I entered kindergarten not speaking English. I know my school put extra resources in to get me up to speed and to get it so I could be an attorney today that has defended individuals and small businesses around this country, that serves in Larimer County as a deputy assessor, and who now is running for office. I think that those resources were well spent to allow me to be here today. And we have kids with special needs. Your school showed us on the tour that you put extra resources in to make sure that those kids get the services that they need. These things cost money, and that is something that we don't all agree that we should pay extra taxes, but then we all agree that we should give kids this opportunity and that we should provide these services, and I think that that's a contradictory statement. If we truly believe in giving equal opportunity, we also have to be willing to put the money behind it. So the right is to a great education, but we need to provide equal opportunity to make that possible.
Thank you, Ms. Zokaie. Now, Ms. Walter.
Thank you very much. In order to answer this question, we first must need to define the terms. What is a right? What is the opportunity? Because otherwise it's subjective, and with the way people are tossing around definitions for words these days, we really don't know what we're talking about until we've defined those terms, and we haven't done that this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walter. Now, Mr. Boesnecker.
Thank you for the question. You know, I would come back to the constitutional rights that are guaranteed folks in our communities in terms of public education. And I would also say, as a former public school teacher myself, it was really important to me that every student that came into my classroom had the resources and every opportunity to succeed that they could have. And I bristle at the notion that because someone doesn't speak English, they don't belong in our classrooms. I bristle at the notion that because someone wants to be called Andy instead of Andrew, that they don't belong in our classrooms. Or that somehow we get to define what is an acceptable right for you when it comes to the opportunity that a public education can grant you. I think at the end of the day, it is the job of a teacher to teach every student that comes into their classroom. That is a sacred responsibility that we owe our younger generation. And when we do that, we recognize the individual needs of each student. And that might be a 504, that might be an IEP, that might be someone who is an English as a second language learner and they have someone sitting next to them to help translate. It might be a paraprofessional in your classroom helping a student succeed. You know, I was a music teacher and I can tell you that students succeeded in different ways in my classroom than they did in a math classroom. And that is opportunity, but it involves fully leaning into the rights that each and every student has to be successful in our educational environment.
Thank you, Mr. Boesnecker. We will now move on to our next audience question. Governor Polis has consistently pushed for full funding of the Charter School Institute Equalization Fund. Do you support the governor's push for funding equity for schools chartered under the State Charter School Institute? Ms. Zokaie, we'll begin with you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And, you know, I honestly do not have enough information to be able to make a stance right now on that, but I can tell you that I will look into it and I will get back to you. I think it's important that we speak about the things where we have full knowledge and that when we don't, we do our research and make sure that it's an informed decision. So I'm going to do that.
Thank you, Ms. Zokaie. Now, Mr. Yurash.
So Governor Polis is known for being an advocate of charter schools and school choice. And so I believe what he's trying to do is good because charter schools are at a disadvantage from a funding perspective. And some of the other panelists did not recognize that fact in their conversation about funding of charter schools because the school buildings for public school, regular public schools are taken care of through separate money from what is allocated to the charter schools. So the charter schools have to pay for their buildings separate. So the amount of money they have per student, per pupil, is actually less than a public school. And so the equalization that the governor, I think, is talking about is to compensate for that fact. And that would put charter schools on a more equal footing to our public schools. So I think that would be a very good thing. I would definitely support that.
Thank you, Mr. Yurash. Now, Mr. Boesnecker.
Yeah, thank you. And this might be a really helpful conversation to have just in terms of how the state budget gets set and how those numbers get set. You know, the governor will come early with his budget proposal, but it is the state legislature that ultimately controls spending in our state. And so that starts depending upon the year in the Senate or the House. We pass the long bill. And in the state of Colorado, it's really important for you to know that we do not run a deficit. We have to balance our budget each and every year, which means every penny is accounted for. So there are always competing interests in the budget, and there's always budget amendments that come out, and there's always a need for more fully funding our public education. The question I would ask about any budget proposal, including this one, is it sustainable? Meaning, is there a directly identified source of revenue that we can carry through year over year to be able to make that promise and hold true on it? And the second question I would ask is it going to move the needle in the biggest way? Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about a scarcity of resources, meaning there is only so much money to go around, we have to make difficult decisions about what to prioritize as a state. Certainly education is at the top of that list, and certainly I appreciate the governor's work in the charter school space. I mean, I think some of the charter schools that he started are really admirable in terms of their focus on equity in communities. However, it's a difficult question because you need that dollar amount, and then you need to put it into conversation with the entirety of the budget.
Thank you, Mr. Boesnecker. Now, Ms. Walter.
Please repeat the question.
Governor Polis has consistently pushed for full funding of the Charter School Institution Equalization Fund. Do you support the governor's push for funding equity for schools chartered under the State Charter School Institute?
You use the word equity. That makes me suspicious because Polis may have all the best intentions, but equity is really not making things equal. So I'm going to have to say I question, I'm suspicious of that and question it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walter. Now, Ms. Kipp.
Thank you, and I'm going to try and get through some of this explanation in 90 seconds. I don't know if I can, but let me give it a shot. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the question is. The Charter School Institute is a separate way of authorizing charter schools. Charter schools can be authorized through their district, as Liberty is here, or there are charter school institute schools that are chartered through the state. What we actually did, and we have put it into statute that this equalization is a thing as of the 2023 School Finance Act, which I basically was a sponsor of, so let's just make that clear. I did support that. But what we have going forward, so what that means is that if you have a charter school that's chartered through the state and it opens up in your school district has authorized certain amounts of mill levy override dollars. And they're saying, well, we think because they don't get that same mill levy override from our local district, that they should get it from the state. So now the state is backfilling this to the tune of $49 million. And I think really the question is, where do we go with this now that it's equalized going forward? How much can the state afford to do, and how large should we allow this pot to grow? Because school districts can just say, well, if we don't want to share our revenues, we can just have the state fund it. But the state does not have unlimited funds, so it can grow to be a problem.
Right, thank you, Ms. Kipp. Now, Ms. McWilliams.
I've spent the last 4 years learning about election law. And after reading the laws, you know, my determination is we need to read the information before we decide what we're going to do about it. I have not read what Governor Polis has put forth, so I really can't commit on what he is offering. And I just would encourage everybody here in this room, start reading what's put on paper by our legislators. They have been detrimental to us and to our rights. So pay attention, take it upon yourself. You got an interest? Look it up. It's very simple. It's not as hard as they make it sound. I mean, I'm a plain, simple person, and I know what the election laws are now, and it scares me to death. Our rights are being taken away from us on paper because we don't know what is being written, and we depend on legislators to do that for us. We can't do that anymore. You need to take time yourself and start reading the legislation that they're talking about. Don't wait till it's already passed. The only opportunity you had after it's passed is to vote that one legislator out. It takes them a long time to take back the laws that have been passed. So it's up to you as parents and as citizens. Do your due diligence and read what they're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McWilliams. Now, Mr. Brosius.
I think it would depend a lot on the details of how that money gets allocated and spent, and whether or not the charter school fund is tax neutral, right? And I remember back in 2013 when they were talking about legalization of cannabis, and it was sold to us by, saying, oh, well, we'll tax it, and that tax money will fund education. We won't have any more problems funding education. Here we are 11 years later, still trying to find money to fund education. So ultimately the question becomes whether or not it's tax revenue neutral, right? Or are we as citizens going to have to pay more in taxes? And how that money then becomes allocated out and is spent from the state government. Not knowing those details, I can't comment up or down at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to the next question. As Americans, where do our rights come from? And how do you see your potential role as the legislator relative to those rights? Mrs. Walter, we'll start with you.
Our rights come from the Lord. We're born with them, and our founding documents protect them for us. We're not given rights by man. We are born with them. And as a legislature, it's our duty to make sure that we don't trample on those by making bills that become law that will take away those rights, as we have seen over and over done, especially the last handful of years, if not longer. So that is my job as a legislator, to make sure that your rights are not trampled on. They didn't come from us. We didn't give them to you. But it is our job to help maintain those and watch out for them.
Thank you. Mr. Boesnecker, we'll move on to you.
Thank you. As your state representative who has served in this capacity in 2021, since 2021, I can tell you that it is the immense honor of a lifetime to swear your oath when you are sworn into office. And you are reminded at that moment just what a humbling and awesome responsibility it is to swear an oath to the Constitution, to recognize that there are rights that are inherent to each and every person in our society, and that it is the job of government to protect those rights and to make sure those rights are held to be true regardless of the political whims of any one party, regardless of any one election cycle, regardless of any one statement or belief that they are somehow above the law or above the Constitution. We saw this play out today. Tina Peters was sentenced to 9 years in prison for neglecting her oath of office and putting herself first as opposed to the sacred responsibility to carry out elections in her county. I can tell you that we can disagree on issues, and we should, because that is the beauty of our country and the way our system of government works. We should have those debates, and they should be robust. However, the rights that each individual in our country has are not up for debate. And as someone who has sworn an oath to the Constitution time and time again, I can tell you that that is a value that we will continue to carry forward regardless of the political headwinds of the day.
Thank you. Mrs. McWilliams, we'll move on to you.
Well, when I think of constitutional right, I know this is simple. But for me, God sent down his angels to tell the founding fathers what we needed in our country to keep our country strong, our republic, our rights, our freedoms. And the people, the founders, experienced things in their own lives that helped them make the decisions for our constitutional rights. As a state legislator, I would always ask before I see a piece of legislation, does this affect our rights and in what way? My concern right now is that we have legislators that are passing bills willy-nilly without really knowing the subject, like our election laws. They're not fully informed. They're just given, like this last session, there was over 400 bills that was passed in a matter of 5 months. And with 24 hours to read, up to 100 pages in one bill. That's ridiculous. Ridiculous to ask our legislators to do that and to set them up to have spend 24 hours discussing a piece of legislation and being on the floor, and then, oh, by the way, we're going to come back next morning at 7:30 after we've been here till 3 o'clock that morning. I mean, things are going on that y'all need to be aware of, and I would do what I could to protect our rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brosius, we'll move on to you.
Your rights come from your mere existence, right? And they're not given to you by any particular person. If you read our Constitution, it doesn't tell you that you have a specific right to do something. What the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, does is it puts restrictions on what government can do to you and your rights. Congress shall make no law, right? The right of the people shall not be infringed. Right? People will not be required to testify against themselves. They are not required to house troops in their quarters, right? So these rights are naturally assumed to exist, and the Constitution limits government, does not grant to people. And every law, I believe, should be viewed through that lens, right? Does this give government more power over the people? Or does it give less power to government? Does it restrict government and empower the individual person and their liberties and their freedoms and their rights? Right? I, as an individual, I cannot violate your right to speech. Only the government can violate your right to speech. I can't do it. And that's the view that should be taken when addressing any legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kipp, we'll move on to you.
Thank you. I see these things sort of as layered, right? You start with the U.S. Constitution. Then you go down to federal law. Then you go down to the state constitution. Then you go down to state law. Then you go down to, more local governments under there. So those are kind of where it goes. But where we are with our rights is it's an ever-evolving landscape, right? Things change over time. We have new Supreme Court justices at the state level, at the federal level. Our rights are interpreted by the judicial system, and right, we've got the judicial branch, we've got the legislative branch, and we've got, executive branch. So as we go through time, it seems like our rights evolve. Do I agree with everything the Supreme Court has done? Absolutely not. I believe they're a rogue Supreme Court. That's a whole nother conversation. But really, they are setting up what our fundamental rights are.
Thank you. Mr. Yurash, we'll move on to you.
So the Declaration of Independence will tell you that our rights come from God, but not everybody's God is the same. So the rights really come from the social contract between us as individuals in a Judeo-Christian society. And so particularly when you compare a Judeo-Christian Western society to Islamic society and their God, their rights are vested in the Ayatollah, and the individual is subservient to that. In Western civilization, the individual is paramount, and I think that's critical for understanding what the rights are. And I would agree with Jeff in a lot of what he said about negative rights and how the government needs to be restricted from infringing upon our rights. So that is a negative rights. The best example, though, is healthcare. Healthcare is not a right and should not be described that way because it is dependent upon abrogating someone else's right to their property, their income, in order to give healthcare to that other person. Healthcare is a very important privilege that we have in a wealthy country. And wealthy countries are generous countries, and it's important that we be generous to those that are less fortunate. But healthcare is not a right. It is a privilege that we need to bestow on as many people as we can because we are so generous.
Thank you. Ms. Zokaie, we'll move on to you.
Thank you. If elected, I look forward to being at the Capitol in January and swearing an oath to uphold the Constitution. Our rights, I think, were perfectly laid out by Representative Kipp when she talked about how they are layered, and it is our job as elected officials to make sure that everybody has access to those rights, regardless of their background or how much money is in their pockets, and regardless of political party. I don't think that that is a partisan issue. It is just making sure that we uphold what this country stands for. This country stands for freedom, for prosperity, and for equal opportunity. And my parents were able to take advantage of that, and I think that there are places in society where we don't have equal opportunity, and it is our job to make sure that all people do have access to a great education, to have access to healthcare, to have equal opportunity to contribute to this economy. And as far as the exclusionary language I have heard this evening, I would like to say that the people who are different in our community, who may be perceived as outsiders or who are immigrants, make us stronger. We are a great place to live and raise a family because we are inclusive and welcoming, and we celebrate our differences and we celebrate our diversity. That is the Fort Collins that I have come to know, and language otherwise is harmful. It is not only emotionally harmful to people who may look different than my opponent, but it is sometimes physically harmful to them as well. And so we need to be very careful that if we're looking to represent this area of Fort Collins, that we do it for all people.
Now we will move on to the final question of the night. This year, the Colorado State Board of Education voted to lower graduation standards by lowering the SAT math threshold required to graduate from 500 to 480. Do you agree with the state board that lowering standards is the appropriate way to address graduation rates? Ms. Kipp, we'll begin with you.
So earlier it was mentioned that now many of our, well, actually all of our public colleges and universities are standardized test score is optional. You do not have to turn in an ACT score or an SAT score in order to apply to our public colleges. That was my bill. I worked on that with the Colorado Department of Higher Education. And we've always known that people's zip codes are very indicative of the test scores that they will achieve. But when the Colorado Department of Higher Education looked into it, as we were looking to pass this legislation, they found that this was even truer than they had known. It is not okay that we only look at standardized test scores. They do not tell the entire story. And a lot of those standardized tests actually have biases in them. And so we don't want to hold kids to biased tests. What we do know, and that we do know, is that according to many of our college admissions counselors, is that there's a lot of other factors that make kids successful when they go on to college. There's factors like having the same principal for a certain, for their entire time, for making sure that they are, whatever school they go to, that they are successful in that school. That is more indicative of their future performance than their score on a test score.
Thank you, Ms. Kipp. Now, Ms. McWilliams.
Okay. Can you repeat the question, please? I'm sorry, I got lost listening.
This year, the Colorado State Board of Education voted to lower graduation standards by lowering the SAT math threshold required to graduate from 500 to 480. Do you agree with the state board that lowering standards is the appropriate way to address graduation rates?
No, I don't, off the top of my head. I believe in achievement. I became a single parent and had the opportunity to go back and get my associate's degree, legal administrative assistant. I felt really good about that. However, I wasn't able to find a job in the legal field. But that didn't make me feel less. And I think a lot of what's going on in our society right now is lower the standards, lower the standards. No, 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 no. Work for what you want. Work and get some satisfaction about your accomplishments. And lowering the standards, I just carte blanche like that, no, I don't agree with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McWilliams. Now, Mr. Brosius.
So the question is, do I agree with lowering the standards from 500 to 480? Correct? My answer to that would be no, I don't agree. And the rationale is multifaceted. One, where does it stop? Do we go to 460 in 3 or 4 years? And then down to 420? And then down to 380? And then down to 300? And then down to, okay, well, you spelled your name right, so you pass. Right? Where does that end? And then the other question, the larger question is, why aren't students capable of meeting that score of 500? Are we not doing a good job of teaching them math? Are we spending too much time teaching other stuff and not teaching math and reading and science and history and civics, right? So that's kind of the two ways I would look at it, right? One, where do we stop with this lowering of the standards? And why aren't we holding people to a higher accountability level in making sure that they're teaching our students how to hit a minimum of 500 on the SAT? So there is my position is, no, let's not lower standards. Let's raise the performance of the kids and do better at teaching them instead of lowering our standards to the lowest common denominator. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brosius. Now, Ms. Zokaie.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't think that we should hold our kids to lower standards. I think that we should hold our kids to the correct standards. And what those standards are need to be studied to see what exactly is the correct metric for determining success. We know that kids test differently depending on what zip code they live in. I think there's a big question as to why. If we have done our job to adequately fund schools and to give proper resources, then we should not see that disparity. But if you look at a school in a lower income neighborhood that might be next to an industrial plant where kids are sick, they're not going to be performing as well. And so I think that that's our job at the state, is to say we want our kids to all excel. We want to hold them to high standards, and we want to help them get there and make sure they have the resources to achieve those standards.
Thank you, Ms. Zokaie. Now, Mr. Yurash.
So I think in this particular case, in this particular time and moment, I think I would be okay with that because you're talking about high school graduation. I mean, what about the dropout rate, right? How many of our kids don't even try to take the test and just drop out before their senior year? That is a very significant problem, right? Because if you can't even graduate from high school, can you work the cash register at the store? Well, maybe you can because you just put your card up there and you don't have to count anymore. So again, I think for just a high school graduation, that's okay. I agree with Jeff that the more important issue is why are our average test scores continuing to decline? Let's figure that out. Let's not harm a few high school students that want to get that high school graduation certificate just because of a couple points on the SAT score. You know, at least they tried. They stuck through it through the end and didn't drop out. The college admission, I think we do not want to drop those standards. And we have a lot of students going to college, getting degrees that do not end up in a sufficient wage and job and career to pay back their debt. That is a huge problem. I do not agree with President Biden unconstitutionally forgiving the debt for all these students. They've made some very poor choices. They had the opportunity to do it the right way, and they did not.
Thank you, Mr. Yurash. Now, Mr. Boesnecker.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, standardized testing is something that I have pretty strong feelings about as a former public school teacher myself, and quite frankly, someone who taught in a Title I school. 70% of our kids were on free and reduced lunch at the school I taught. The mealtime at breakfast and then at lunch might have been the only 2 meals that they got each day, aside from the granola bars and snacks that I kept inside of my classroom. And so I can say with certainty that yes, your zip code can impact your ability to test like other students. And then there are inherent inequities in that system that puts forward a standardized test as the metric by which your next step in education could be determined. So I do believe that we do need to do more to make sure that our students have the resources and the education they need to succeed. But I also don't believe that standardized testing is an accurate representation of what a student's capability is. And I'll say that from a perspective of someone who also has dyslexia that runs in their family. We have students in my family who will never test like other students, even with accommodations, even with all of the things that a 504 or an IEP can grant them. And that is not a predictor of that student's ability or intelligence. It is simply a result of a standardized test coming in front of them and it being, quite frankly, inaccessible for them given their learning needs. And so I think there is a need to look at these things and understand the inequities that are inherent in our system, and it should be our job as a legislature to work on those pieces and question whether or not a standardized test is actually capturing the full potential of a student.
Thank you, Mr. Boesnecker. Now, Ms. Walter.
Thank you. I will answer the question whether lowering SAT threshold to address graduation rates should be done. No, lowering the SAT threshold does not address the issue as to why the students are struggling. So, in answer to the question, no.
Thank you. Now, that's all the time we have for questions tonight. Candidates will now make their closing statements. Each candidate will be allowed 30 seconds to make their closing statement. Mr. Yurash, we'll begin with you.
Thanks. I've had a really good time during this forum, and the questions were very thought-provoking. I thought that was really good. As a candidate for the Colorado Center Party, I want to be the new voice of the moderate majority. We are not getting candidates in the middle, and we really need that. I'm really tired of having all these extreme candidates left and right. We need something in the middle, so please consider supporting the Center Party. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yurash. Now, Ms. Zokaie.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity to have this thoughtful exchange of ideas. I think it's very important. You know, I'm here as a testament that grassroots organizing and people coming together can beat big money interests. Went against hundreds of thousands of dollars that was flooded into my primary race, went against billionaires, and I think that that's really important to go knock doors, talk to our community, raise money locally, because I only want to be responsive to all of you and not to these big money interests. So I look forward to hopefully winning in November
Right,
and being
thank you,
able to
Ms.
serve as your
Zokaie.
next
Now,
representative.
Ms. Walter.
Thank you. What drives the legislature today is driven by an ideology which has two core beliefs. Your children are principal wards of the state, and every common problem can and should be solved by government. Children and taxpayers need protection against what threatens them at the local level and what is allowed to happen to you from the legislature. With that, we need a representative that will protect your rights, children and taxpayers alike. I appreciate your support. Thank you for your vote. Donna Walter.
Thank you, Ms. Walter. Now, Mr. Boesnecker.
Yeah, thank you so much for the forum this evening. I think just a huge rounds of gratitude and congratulations to our students for pulling off something so admirable. This is exactly what we need in our society, more discourse and not less, more civic engagement and not less. And I can tell you that is a core value that I've held to be true since my time in the state legislature. It does not matter to me if you are a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or something else. If you come to our office for assistance, we will do our best to help you with whatever that is. We're here to listen, we're here to serve you, and if sent back to the state legislature, I'd be honored to continue doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Boesnecker. Now, Ms. McWilliams.
You know, I'm really encouraged to see this event put on by the students. That's very hopeful for me. And I want to encourage everybody here to please. We are finding out that a lot of people are dropping out. They're not voting. They need to vote. And if you care about your property taxes, you want lower taxes, you want to protect your kids, your property rights, your water rights, your sanctity of life, I wish that you would consider me. Phoebe at Colorado.com.
Thank you, Ms. McWilliams.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Brosius.
Yeah, so I would echo everyone else and say thanks to the students for putting this forum together, and thanks to all of you for coming out and attending today. It's great that you guys are involved in coming out and listening to your candidates. I see Colorado is #1 in the country for auto theft, #1 in the country for cocaine use. Denver's 5th in the country for package theft. Colorado's 3rd. Colorado's 3rd in violent crime. And I'll tell you, the one party that didn't get us there is the Libertarian Party of Colorado. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Brosius. Now, Ms. Kipp.
Thank you. I'm going to save some time by saying ditto on everything that Representative Boesnecker said. And I just want to say I think you've heard a huge diversity of opinions and grasp of concepts, frankly, tonight. So I hope that you will continue the conversation with each of us as you go forward and determine who you're supporting in this election. But, we do support listening to everybody in the audience and what your needs and thoughts are. So thanks for hosting this debate, or not debate, but forum.
Thank you, Ms. Kipp, and thank you all for your closing statements. I'd like to thank the candidates for participating in the forum, our audience for attending the forum, our student panel for conducting this forum, and our amazing staff that helped set all of this up. I know many of you submitted questions that were not asked tonight, but you can contact the candidates directly with your questions if you would like them answered. Ballots for the 2024 election will be mailed between October 11th and 18th and must be returned by November 5th. We have recorded this candidate forum, and we will be sending out the link soon. And with that, the forum is concluded. Thank you all for attending.